First he said he was under a lot of pressure. Then he went into the laundry room. Then I heard a clunk. Then he said, ow.
I see. The clunk would explain the bump.
The clunk would explain the bump? We're not doctors, Nurse Bennett. Give it to us in layman's terms.
I just wanted to let you know about my study group.
Oh, don't be a fuddy-duddy. I'll be your study buddy.
I'm about to embark on one of the great challenges of my scientific career.
This work right here is going to change history.
I think this is going to be our greatest mission.
I don't have time to study. I'll never get into Stanford.
I got big plans for you tonight. I got maps, I got charts. I got to see you through this because my credibility is on the line.
It's at this point that you'll want to start taking notes.
Welcome to the Sitcom Study, the podcast where we contemplate the TV shows we grew up with and search for the truth and wisdom within the tropes and cliches. And Amy, we have a whopper of a trope today. What are we talking about?
Got hit. Who dis?
Yeah, could not have said it better myself. We are talking about the trope of getting bopped on the head and having your personality changed.
Yes.
This was one of the first things that popped into this was one of the reasons why we make the podcast, right?
Amnesia-based alter egos.
Yeah, exactly. And specifically having to do with some sort of head trauma. This whole thing of they walked into the closet as Michael and they came back out as Michelle. You know, this is something that just they love to do it. It's very silly. I don't think it has a ton of basis in real life, especially the strategies to undo it when it does happen. But what are the shows we're talking about?
So the shows we are talking about, we've got a bunch in the 60s this time. We're starting with the Flintstones, Season 1, Episode 5, Split Personality. And then the Addams Family, Season 1, Episode 22, Amnesia in the Addams Family. Gilligan's Island, Season 3, Episode 24, The Second Ginger Grant. And finally, we've been waiting and waiting with bated breath for Charles in Charge. Season 4, Episodes 14 and 15. We get a double dose of Chaz.
Yes, covering Charles in Charge for the first time on the podcast is a historic moment for the pod. It's a historic moment in my life, but we'll get to all that. Let me ask you first, Amy, have you ever had a traumatic brain injury that changed your personality?
I'm sorry, who are you?
I'll take that as a I don't know what. I was thinking when we were watching these that this trope is basically the story of regarding Henry, except without the reverse bop curing you.
Right. And in fact, some of the other episodes that are on our trope list are a parody of regarding Henry. They're like regarding whoever, and like they do that same bit.
Right. These ones couldn't do it because that movie didn't exist yet. Traumatic brain injuries are no laughing matter. I have nightmares about this. I still remember the videos they showed you in the 5-hour driving course about what happens when you get into a car accident and your brain gets messed up. It is a terrifying, serious thing. So I don't want to make light of that. It is a thing that happens in real life, but not in any way, shape, or form that resembles the way it happens in these TV sitcoms. And boy, do they love to do it. So I guess let's start with our first show, right? The Flintstones.
Here we go. So in this Flintstones episode, we're season 1, we're early on, and there's not even a Flintstones theme song yet. That didn't exist until season 3. So we were very confused when this episode started.
This is one of those things like Jason doesn't have his hockey mask until part 3 of Friday the 13th, and James Bond doesn't have the gun barrel sequence until Goldfinger. Yeah, the original Flintstones episodes apparently do not have that iconic opening. But beyond that, we get a pretty straightforward story, right? It starts with Fred is angry at Barney because he drank his do you remember what it's called? It's like his rock cola or something?
Yeah, it's something cool, a cactus cola. And it's supposed to be like a beer that he's so excited to get home from work and have. So after that kind of preview, cold open thing, and then the long extended credit sequence that was not Meet the Flintstones.
No,
that
but
the way
was
we
very
know it.
clearly the inspiration for The Simpsons open.
Yes.
It's Fred making his way home from work.
Right. And so the first scene that we get after that is Barney and Betty, and Barney's working on his car, and he needs to borrow some kind of tool from Fred. So he goes next door, and Fred's not there. He's still probably stuck in traffic, Wilma says, trying to get home from work. And Barney is being very nice, and he's like, oh, well, can I borrow this from Fred? Oh, I'll just go and grab it from his garage. He won't mind. He looks in the refrigerator and sees that he has a coconut cola there, and it is spelled Coola, a coconut cola. And he's like, oh, that would be refreshing on this hot day. I've been outside working on the car, and Fred won't mind. I'll just take it. And so he takes it and leaves. And she's like, man, that Barney is such a nice guy. If only Fred had just a little bit of that. He'll come in here any second and be grousing and yelling, and he never gets home and does chores. He just complains.
Yeah, we see Fred immediately as, like we were talking about a few episodes ago, the cartoon version of Jackie Gleason from The Honeymooners. He's blustery and kind of grumpy, and you also see those old-timey gender roles that we know and love. He's a sort of authority figure in the house. Like, you see this dynamic of Wilma, like, I don't think she's a battered woman or anything, but the sense of like, oh, I hope Fred's in a good mood. And, that whole, just that sort of uneasy dynamic from those times. But I do want to say the women characters in this are hilarious. Wilma and Betty are so funny. The voices are hilarious. The way they render their facial expressions, because it's so simple, like they kind of have that way of talking like Lucy and Ethel. They just sound like those old-timey kind of daffy ladies, and they're just really funny.
Yeah, and I would say I think that they're not daffy at all. I think they are funny, and they hold their own against these ridiculous husbands that seem to think they're in charge, but really are just like grumpy old men. And the ones who are holding the house down and keeping everything moving are the women.
Yeah.
And I think, Wilma is an awful lot like Alice, like you were saying, or Lucy for sure. Mm-hmm. Betty's an awful lot like Ethel for sure. They definitely fall into that same kind of era.
Yeah. So Fred, long story short, is really mad at Barney. He comes home and he's having this whole diatribe about how traffic was horrible and work sucks, but the one thing I can count on is my cactus cola or, coconut cola or whatever the hell it is. And so he's furious. He goes next door and yells at Barney. I thought it was hilarious. I never noticed before. Fred's like twice the size of Barney. It's just so funny the way they draw them as being like, just completely out of proportion. Yeah. Watching the two of them talk to each other, it just got me thinking, as a child of the 80s, it's so funny seeing them in a TV show and realizing like most of my experience with these characters is from cereal commercials, cereal commercials and vitamins.
Yeah.
Like what
vitamins
a weird,
for sure. Push pops.
Yeah. Like what a weird turn of events that were like, let's make Fred and Barney from the Flintstones just synonymous with sugary cereals and vitamins.
At this time, though, they were synonymous with Winston cigarettes because that was the sponsor for this show. And there was almost always some sort of like brought to you by Winston or product placement of Winston. And whatever the tagline for Winston's, you see Fred lighting up a cigarette at the end of the day or whatever. But all that has been scrubbed from syndication because they only bought the sponsorship for the episodes as they aired. So that was all taken out later on.
Yeah, that is kind of a bummer. I would like to see like just the hilarious anachronisms of, characters smoking cigarettes on a show like that.
And you can find that on YouTube because those clips do still exist.
Sure. But anyway, all of this is just sort of establishing for us or emphasizing for us how much of a grump Fred is.
Kind of a grump and a brute and is not, isn't even as, Barney's not like the end all be all man, but at least he's polite.
Yeah, he comes
nice.
Over to
he's
somebody's
good-natured.
House. Yeah. Yeah. And Wilma says at some point, And I quote, she wants Fred to be calm, urbane, with a smile on his lips, right?
Right.
So that sort of sets up our be careful what you wish for scenario.
Exactly. So he's yelling at Barney and he's like, I can't believe you drank my last cactus cola. It's the only thing I look forward to all day long. I'm so miserable and I'm so angry now. And yeah, well, you think, and he reaches over and he grabs a bottle that looks exactly like the close up that we got of the cactus cola earlier. Only this time it says car polish and he chugs the entire thing. And I'm sitting there watching this like, oh my gosh, did I get this episode wrong? Like, does he not get banged on the head? Does he turn into some other amnesia alter ego because he drinks poison? Oh no, that's completely forgotten when he goes, what? And he throws the bottle up in the air and it comes back down and bonks him on the head. And it doesn't matter that he just chugged an entire bottle of poison.
Yeah, it could have just been anything that tasted bad. You're also getting at something I'm noticing in general with all of these plot mechanics and everything. Nothing has anything to do with them being cavemen. You know, the fact that the record player is a little bird is like there are visual gags.
Well, and that's something I made note of throughout the episode because I was like, because they make a meal out of it every time they have these things that are like, oh, look, our garbage disposal. It's a dinosaur underneath the, and you have this like whole long shot of like the garbage, the food scraps going into the sink and the happening. And Wilma says, I just don't know what we would do without our garbage disposal. And she pulls back a curtain and there's a little dinosaur under there eating. And so I just thought that was really funny. There was another one they did where they said later on we get Fred singing opera. This is the thing that they showed us twice in the preview and then later in the episode. And Betty says, oh, it's a mastodon, must be caught in the tar pits again because it sounds like a dog howling. And that's like their comparison of a dog howling. And then the other one was that their shower is an elephant or some kind of like ancient version of an elephant.
Right. And that stuff, of course, that's what makes it what it is. Like, that's what all of these 60s sitcoms are, is like, let's do a normal family show and all the stories are just going to be these tropes that have already been done on The Honeymooners and I Love Lucy, but we're monsters or we're cavemen or whatever. And it's layering this gimmick onto this otherwise sort of paint by numbers scenario. But my issue is that, besides a handful of those visual gags, it's just nothing, you're telling me you couldn't come up with a way for Fred to get bopped on the head that has more to do with being in prehistoric times than him drinking car oil? Like, that's...
car polish, yeah.
Yeah, like, it seems like already they've given up on making the prehistoric angle part of the story in any meaningful way.
Yeah, I think the way that they've done it is just in like, oh wait, look at this sight gag, isn't that funny? And it like gives them a moment, like every time they have a fun little idea of, oh, the wheels can be stone and it can be like a golf cart, but like pedal power, foot power. I think they had a blast. Like the animators had a blast coming up with all those different little funny ways they could show like new things that are sort of new and cool in the homes in the 50s, and to have that be, oh, this other thing, like what would be the Stone Age version of da-da-da.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that cleverness is in the animation and not in the writing.
Right.
But let's get to the main crux of this. Fred gets bopped on the head or bops himself on the head with the bottle or whatever. He becomes Frederick. And I thought this was so funny. And you see, I'm sure this isn't originating these tropes, but you see the tropes that have persisted through time memoriam, that when you're fancy, you call other people by fancier versions of their names, even though they don't want you to. I love that.
What was Barney's name?
Bernard. He calls Barney Bernard. And he goes around.
Elizabeth.
And he says something to Betty, like all sort of charming. He goes like, oh, you're the picture of beauty and grace or something. And she's like swept off her feet. Betty is like, oh, Frederick.
Yeah.
And her whole reaction to him is hilarious. I was taken off guard by how much this worked on me.
So apparently, this voice is a character that the guy who does the voice of Fred Flintstone, Alan Reed, he used to do this character called Falstaff Openshaw on this other show, like the Fred Allen radio show that he was on years before, like all the Hanna-Barbera stuff. And so, yeah, so that is that character's voice. So he had it down pat. And that also, when he sings the opera, he used to do that in either this same funny character or a different character. Mm-hmm. So that opera part is something that he had sung before.
So Frederick draws the ire of all the other husbands, right?
First, the women are so into everything that he's doing, and he's doing the dishes, and he's, making, like, he's very cultured, and he's complimentary, and he's bringing home gifts all the time, and he's helping out with the cleaning. I was like ticking off all of the love languages that he was fulfilling, because like he was doing all those things, and the guys are getting all annoyed, and they don't know that Fred is Frederick. Only Barney knows that Fred is Frederick. So they're like, who's this Frederick guy our wives keep talking about? He's the worst because, he's doing all these things. And I was kind of like, he's actually just being like a good husband.
Well, there's two sides to that, because Betty is like, yes, everybody be more like Frederick. And I took note of when Barney says, when Betty is calling out Barney, be more like Frederick, he says, that's sissy talk. Regular guys don't talk like that, which was, just interesting sign of the times. Yeah. But Wilma at first is charmed by Frederick, but then she starts to realize this guy, he's so hoity-toity.
Yeah. Is it possible for Frederick, or is it possible for a husband to be too nice? And she breaks the fourth wall and says this direct to camera.
Yeah. But also, it's not just his niceness. It's his weird, like you said, he's cultured now. So his idea of a good time is to go to a spelling bee.
To go to a spelling bee and also to sing opera in the evenings, just like sitting around and having a lovely time, darling. I'm going to sing some opera. And she's just like, oh, geez. Like, I like that you bought me a fur, but I'm really not interested in all the rest.
I also noticed when Wilma is trying on her fur, her stand-up mirror is like the monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's like this giant slab of stone. But she's like, being a good guy is one thing, but like I want to like do normal stuff. He's lost his ability to bowl, for one thing. So he shows up at the bowling night and he's throwing gutter balls and being all fancy pants.
Yeah, well, so Barney doesn't want to hang out with him anymore, and it was going to go to the bowling night without him. And Betty was like, you can't do that. Like, yes, he's different, but he needs to be included in the guy stuff. He's the captain of the team. Go invite him. And so she forces Barney to go over there and invite him, and he does. And then he very quickly reveals himself to be Frederick, and then all the guys come chasing after him, and he's got to run out of the bowling alley. And he doesn't want to go to the bowling night in general, but Barney convinces him by saying, you're the captain. And he's like, well, I am never one to shirk from duty.
Appeals to his pride.
Yes. So he goes. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that Wilma, as she realizes that she doesn't like it's become too much, he's gone overboard. One of the things she tries to do to kind of get him back to his normal self is to show him pictures of who he was before he got hit on the head. And he remembers. He says, oh, that was my uncouth period. He's the only one out of all of these people that's true with, that he's like, oh no, I changed on purpose, which I was like, oh, that's interesting.
And it's also interesting because it's the one strategy we're going to get in all these episodes that might actually work in real life or be suggested by like a sane psychiatrist when somebody loses their memory or something.
Sure. But instead, in the Flintstones, we get the very first, how do we deal with this? Well, let's call a doctor. And the doctor is a quack. And that's what happens in most of our episodes. They seek a medical opinion and they get bad medical advice. And the medical advice is, in this case, nothing, right? Because the guy turns out to be a veterinarian and it doesn't even know what he's doing. Yeah. So he leaves, and then Barney goes, you know what? I bet if we hit him on the head the same way he hit himself on the head, I'll undo it.
Yeah. So this is something that's going to come up again and again. I wonder, is it because this works sometimes with like radios and stuff? Like the idea of like a machine can like get jostled.
Oh, you can like bang the side of your TV and it'll go back to normal.
I don't think that any version or variation of this could ever possibly work in real life. There is no even sliver of credibility to the idea that a second brain injury could somehow reverse the first. And yet we love to latch onto this in these stories.
Yeah. How do you undo amnesia? Well, you hit him again. So yeah, Barney and Wilma and Betty, right? I think Betty's holding Frederick outside and talking to him about something. And Wilma and Barney are putting a big stone, like just like you would kind of put a trick bucket to dump water on somebody's
head. Like they did
head.
to Piggy in Lord of the Flies.
Right. Like when you go to open a door, the bucket of water or whatever will fall on your head. In this case, a stone, like a big heavy stone is going to fall on his head. And he opens, they call for him and he comes in and he opens the door and the stone hits him on the head and they're like, well, Frederick, and he's like, what are you calling me that for? Blah, blah, blah. And he's back to his old grumpy self.
Yeah, he remembers his bowling team and yeah, all's well that ends well. Like I said, I thought that this was going to be kind of a chore and just kind of lame and stupid. And it was really funny. And because they haven't introduced the children or anything yet, it's so simple and straightforward. And yeah, just every time Wilma or Betty would open their mouths, I thought it was funny. This was very fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed this very much.
Okay, let's hop ahead a few years to the Addams Family.
Addams Family, we're looking at season 1, episode 22, Amnesia in the Addams Family.
Yep, so this is our second time talking about the Addamses. I think I wasn't a super fan the first time around, but I liked them better than the Munsters. I don't know, what's your feelings going into the Addams Family?
Before I watched it, I was looking forward to it. I thought this was a funny episode. I really enjoy watching the Addams Family for the way Morticia moves around. But I think this also kind of is that same thing that the Flintstones do. It's how can we flip whatever normal family thing is and make it Stone Age. This one is how can we flip whatever normal family thing is and make it macabre.
Yeah. And we also, last time we talked about the Addamses, I had my whole sort of diatribe about how by making them so different and like quote unquote freaky and weird, it sort of reestablishes all of these norms of our society. It sort of teaches us what a normal family is by having them be the opposite day. And so with this episode, we get a flip on the flip, right? We get now the central character turning normal and sort of reacting the way a quote unquote normal person would or should react if they suddenly found themselves in a household that was so spooky and ooky and weird.
Right.
So it begins with them, they're filling out their wills or doing some sort of legal thing, right?
Yeah. So
insurance.
So Gomez has just taken out $1 million double indemnity life insurance policy on himself to benefit Morticia.
And this was a decade or so after Double Indemnity, the movie, which is one of the most famous film noirs from the 40s about this murder, this, double-crossing woman that gets this insurance guy into trouble. So I was thinking that this whole sort of premise was a little bit of a nod to Double Indemnity, that aspect of it.
Yeah, because, what happens is, Gomez, he bangs his head and his personality changes, like what is happening in all of these episodes. And then, just like in all of these episodes, the answer to that is we have to figure out a way to hit him on the head again to change him back. But this one gets a little more farcical in terms of everyone in the family has that same idea, but they don't share it with each other. And so everyone is trying to hit him and they keep doing it and undoing it and doing it again and undoing it again. So his personality keeps changing back and forth throughout the episode, confounding Morticia, who keeps like walking into the room and dealing with a different person. But but also after a few times, Morticia, one of the last times, hits Fester by accident, and Gomez sees it. And when he's in his alter ego personality, and he is like, they're trying to kill me. They're trying to kill me because they want my insurance money.
Yeah, right. That also plays into it, that because they're doing this life insurance thing. The way he gets hit is his Indian clubs.
Yeah.
I don't even know what this is.
So I didn't either. And I was also nervous. I was like, oh gosh, what are these?
They look like bowling pins.
They do. So they're an exercise equipment from India.
Oh.
So, and
is this the one case where a show is less racist than we thought?
I mean, yes and no. It's still very imperialist and colonial, because the way they came to be called Indian clubs is that the British Navy, who was stationed in India when they were the imperial power there, the British Navy officers started using them to do workouts as fitting with a local custom, because that was something that the locals used to do workouts. And so they started using them, and then they became a thing that they took back to Great Britain. And that's how they were. That's why they became called Indian clubs, where I'm assuming the non-colonial name is something else.
So yeah, he's messing around with those, bobs himself in the head. He doesn't get a fake name or anything. He just, like I said, becomes a normie. You know, again, love those old-timey gender roles. A lot of this plays out with how Morticia dresses and her choice of wardrobe, and which clothes of her he's going to insist she destroy versus which ones he insists she wears.
Yes, he doesn't get a new name, but he does say who's Gomez. So he doesn't tell us what his actual name is, but he says to Morticia, who's Gomez? And then he's like, oh, I don't believe we've met to her.
This
so
one is
he doesn't.
forget.
Yeah, he doesn't remember his family. He's like, we're married? We have children?
Yes.
Oh, so you're saying we've been more than friends? And
Yeah.
she's like, we're married. And, you know, so there's all of that. Well, so Morticia recommends that they go to his study, you know, and put him on the rack or laying on the bed of nails or something like that to kind of straighten him out, because he's not feeling well. So they'll go to their sort of spa that they have in their house, where Grandma and Uncle Fester are currently getting treatments as well. And Uncle Fester's on some sort of vice that like squeezes his head until he gets a headache. And Grandmama is in the stocks, right? Where you would like be in the town square and they throw tomatoes at you. So she's in the stocks, and she's like, oh, I need to stay in here for at least another 2 hours to get my beauty rest. And Gomez, he makes multiple jokes about how his family and his children are ugly. So, you know, he was like, when Grandmama said that was her beauty rest, he was like, maybe stay in there a little longer, making fun of how she looks. And then when Morticia takes them to see the children, thinking maybe that will help, and Pugsley and Wednesday are crashing trains. They're playing with the train set. And I think Morticia at one point is like, oh, you know, Pugsley's the vision of you, or the portrait of you. And he turns and he looks at Pugsley and he's like, oh, is there a mirror around here?
Yeah, his reaction to everything, he's horrified, but in a snarky way. Like, his reaction to everything is just to make little quips.
Right.
I was noticing as we went through this, I think Fester and Wednesday are the characters that really suffer the most from comparison to the 90s version. You know, when I watch these older ones, John Astin as Gomez and the lady that does Morticia and everything, like, they have a certain charm where it's like, oh, this is a totally different thing, but this is fun. But every time that Fester is on or the kids are on, I'm just kind of like, oh boy, Christopher Lloyd was really good in that 90s one. Christina Ricci, she was really good. And yeah, it's just that generational comparison. I think those older versions don't hold up as well of those characters.
And also in this version, Wednesday's younger and a lot smaller than Pugsley, where I'm assuming they didn't necessarily change her age for the stuff in the 90s, but I just always had the impression that Wednesday was the older sister to Pugsley because she was so much more in charge.
Yeah, in the TV show, they come across as little kids, kind of like we were talking about the little ones in the Partridge Family.
Right.
They're going to be a little proper, a gag here and there. In the movies, especially the second one, they really make them characters and part of it. So it's a little bit of an apples to oranges thing. Just something I noticed. But anyway, the story sort of settles into, like you said, this kind of silly farce where they're all bopping him on the head because no one's on the same page. They've all got the same idea. This was disturbing to me. Again, the idea
was hit so many times
of this guy just again and again getting struck on the head. Obviously, it's, getting upset about this is like getting upset about the Roadrunner. But I'm just like, oh, boy, that I don't like that idea.
Well, so, okay, the one thing about this that was a little bit weird to me was their whole thing is like violence is what they do for fun. Yet Morticia didn't want to hit him in the head because she didn't want to hurt him because she loved him so much. And so she convinced Fester to do it. And all of the family, it would like if it was any other episode, going to hit someone in the head or beating each other with baseball bats or whatever would be just a normal, like, oh, look at our funny joke. We're going to go play baseball, which really just means we whack each other in the head. Like, that would be a normal thing. But this time they didn't want, like, they were all a little nervous about hitting him and they felt bad because they didn't want to hurt him. And I thought that was really interesting. I'm like, that doesn't really fit with like the way that they normally do things. But we did have a nice kids scene, though, where the kids they come up with the idea to hit him in the head. All, like I said, everybody has the idea sort of independently, and they all grab an Indian club and do it. But Wednesday gets a little moment where she's like, Pugsley, you have to do this, and don't worry about him. He'll be distracted. And she is like, Daddy, will you tell me that story again about, whatever. And it completely distracts him so Pugsley can whack him.
Yeah, Morticia gets her idea from a big book, some sort of like big book. Science book.
Yes,
yeah.
It's a medical book. Yet again, where do we get this information from? Medical professionals tell us to undo amnesia, bop him on the head again.
Yeah, I wrote down pseudoscience at best. But yeah, it all, sooner or later, he's back to normal. And we get the subtrope of the secondary victim of the personality change, right? The sort of collateral damage that while we're fixing character A, character B is going to somehow get bopped on the head. So we can end on this note of, here we go again.
Right. So Fester gets accidentally whacked. We don't hear much from him for the rest of the episode. And then the button at the end is he's like, who's Fester?
Yeah. Like I said, this is obviously, it's a fun idea for this show. It's a way to, just give everyone a chance to sort of double down or reiterate all of their wackiness and, just to let Gomez have his opposite day and, be different than he normally is.
Right. There was a few really fun moments in this episode. So Morticia gets to make a little bit of a meal out of this. So, they have these like nicknames, Bubala and Maryanne, all of this.
Oh, yeah.
And he doesn't like, when he's in his alter ego state, he doesn't like Bubala, even though Bubala really turns him on normally.
Mm-hmm.
So she calls him Bubala and he's like, oh, please don't. I mean, call me anything. Call me Honey Bun, Doll Boy.
Yeah.
And so Morticia has this inner monologue that's like going over the faces that she's making. And you can see it all happening in her face. She's just like, oh God, he's the worst. He's not even a man anymore. I can't take much more of this. This is horrible. I hate this guy. Blah, blah, blah. And then she looks back at him and she like chokes out the words, "Oh boy," and then, makes her way upstairs. We see her actually do one stair in this episode. They have to do all sorts of camera tricks in multiple scenes. One time where she's coming down the stairs, Fester's calling to her after he's bopped him the second time to turn him back into Gomez and actual Gomez. And he calls to Morticia and she's at the top of the stairs and we see her like fake walk downstairs. Like what's happening is that she's just
right, like
kind
the
of
old trick of
bending her
going
knees
behind the counter and saying, I'm going to the basement.
Yes. And then they only are filming her from the waist up, so she could have like hauled up the dress and actually done stairs because she can't walk in stairs in that dress. And then we see her, they like cut the shot and she's just coming down the last 2 steps, only that's not where she was. They have this like forced perspective. She's actually next to the staircase and moving into frame to make it look as though she's come down the stairs. It's so great. I was like, oh my gosh, the camera tricks they have to do with this woman's costume. And then at the end of that scene, she turns around to go back up the stairs and takes 1 step, and then it cuts away. But I was pretty impressed. And then the other thing that I thought was really funny is that one of the ways they show he's like not regular Gomez, he's this like normcore Gomez, is that he's reading a stock ticker.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he's a man of the, the times.
As men do. They sit here with their stock ticker and they read it.
Yeah. So look, for the love of God, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Don't hit the person
or
with
6 wrongs in this case.
Repeated brain injuries don't help.
So they end the episode with Thing sandpapering the lumps off of Gomez's head because he's gotten so many. It gave me the willies.
That is some Rob Zombie torture porn stuff.
And it was the entire last good minute and a half of the episode is just Thing sandpapering the back of John Astin's head. And it was like I could barely listen to the lines because it was giving me the willies.
Okay, so much for Addams Family. Let's move forward in time a couple years to Gilligan's Island.
Gilligan's Island, Season 2, Episode 24, The Second Ginger Grant. This is the second time that Gilligan's Island does an amnesia plot. The first was in Season 1, and we had the skipper have amnesia, and all sorts of hilarity ensues. We chose this one specifically because this was the one where Maryanne thinks she's Ginger. So her alter ego, Maryanne, trips over a rock and bangs her head after watching Ginger perform, a la Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah.
And she was just enraptured during the performance. And so when she comes to after hitting her head, Maryanne thinks she Ginger.
Has become Ginger. But let's back up for a second. This is our first time talking Gilligan's Island. This is another big, it's a show that casts a big footprint, I think, but a little bit of a punchline. I think Gilligan's Island, to me, when we were growing up, it was already before our time. It was already in the past. It was synonymous with an old, goofy sitcom. You would say, that guy sits around watching Gilligan's Island all day, and that's meant to mean he's a screw-up,
Yeah, and I think that was, well, first of all, Gilligan's Island only lasted 3 seasons, and it's because, there's some controversy going that I can tell you about, but it was not popular amongst grown-ups. Yeah. It was popular amongst younger people, and it had like this prime spot on CBS. And so we are watching kind of the end of the 3rd season here. In its 3rd season, the showrunner, the producers were told by a CBS executive, "You've been renewed. How great." The professor and Maryanne went out and bought new houses, thinking everything was secure. And then Gunsmoke was canceled on another network. And the head, the CEO of CBS was like, that's my wife's favorite show. We can't cancel that. We need to find a way to get that back on the air. And so they canceled another sitcom that was going to start that year called Doc and Gilligan's Island so that Gunsmoke could have its place. And Gunsmoke did very well for itself, rebounded its ratings to previous levels and even exceeded it and ran for 20 seasons, whereas Gilligan's Island was only popular with some young folks. But I would contend that Gilligan's Island has kind of become like a cult classic.
Yeah, I think we've talked about how growing up we were sort of at the mercy of which old-timey shows would come on Nick at Night or these syndicated things. So for me, we had Brady Bunch, we had Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore. I don't remember really having Gilligan's Island.
I had Gilligan's Island.
I'm sure it was available somewhere on the dial.
And Flipper.
Yeah, see, we had Lassie. For whatever reason, I don't remember Gilligan's Island being on a lot. My dad was a fan of Dobie Gillis, who was, that's the TV show that Bob Denver was on before this. He played Maynard G. Krebs, the beatnik, dopey best friend. And then he parlayed that success into the lead role on Gilligan. So if anything, I was a little more familiar with Dobie
Gillis.
With Dobie Gillis.
And Maynard, whatever.
Yeah, than with Gilligan. But yeah, I've always thought of this as, like I said, its legacy is a legacy of silliness.
Yes. A 3-hour tour, but yet they have like hundreds of outfits, and then random other people are able to come to the island.
Electricity.
And all sorts of things that, yes, it's very ridiculous, but it's funny, and it was, it gives us a lot of room to play around in, and the Skipper and Gilligan relationship with little Buddy and all of that is funny, but most of that doesn't exist in this episode. This too kind of turns into a farce.
Yeah.
And so Maryanne comes to, thinks she's Ginger. The professor checks her out. So the professor is not only a professor, but he's also a doctor. Like anything having to do with academia, he's got.
Yeah,
so
he's your Frasier. He's
yes.
your generic, sophisticated, intellectual guy.
He invents radios. He knows how to hypnotize. He's a psychiatrist. He's
now, when
all
you
of the
say
things.
he knows these things, his theories are ridiculous. His hypotheses are absurd, right?
Sure,
he's just
but he's the reason
nonsense.
they have electricity. So anyway, yes, he is throwing out nonsense, but he's consulting his books that he brought for this 3-hour tour. So he says, look, if we confront Maryanne with what she perceives as an alternate reality, she'll have like a traumatic brain event. Like it won't compute, and she'll have a complete breakdown. So we all have to play along and act like she's Ginger. And that includes Ginger. You have to now dress up like Maryanne, because if she thinks she's Ginger and she sees another Ginger, that's going to throw her for a loop. It's not going to be good. And she's also going to wonder where Maryanne is.
Yeah. I wrote, this scenario makes the other shows seem realistic. Like, this is so much worse.
So convoluted, but it gets more convoluted.
Just the idea, just that getting bopped on the head and having your brain generate a new personality isn't enough. You somehow become the person that you're looking at or thinking about. And then this guy's plan is, we need to have you, Ginger, disguise yourself as Maryanne. It's just so wild.
Well, and the most fun part of all of this is in what keeps happening is that Mr. Howell has to explain to Mrs. Howell what's going on, because Mrs. Howell is like in their tent or their like camp or whatever. And Mr. Howell has been around and is seeing all of the things that are going on. So he's trying to relay to Mrs. Howell what's happening. And he's like, okay, so Maryanne is Ginger. So Ginger is Maryanne. She's dressing up. She's getting a wig. And Mrs. Howell's like, wait, what? And so they have this whole round robin thing where they keep trying to explain that Maryanne is Ginger and Ginger is Maryanne, but Maryanne is like this and Ginger's like that. And it's crazy. And then the professor decides, okay, so she's not snapping out of it. I need to hypnotize her. And if I hypnotize her, then I can change her back into Maryanne. And Gilligan is eavesdropping, like snooping on them while they're doing that. And he's watching the hypnosis happen.
Right.
And so he gets hypnotized. It works on him, but it doesn't work on Maryanne. So when the professor snaps his fingers, she wakes up and she's still doing her Ginger voice, like, oh, I don't know what's going on. And what the professor has said is that when you hear the word Maryanne, you will become Maryanne. Well, Gilligan walks away before he hears the professor say the word Maryanne. So he goes off to wherever he is, and then somebody says something about Maryanne, which immediately turns
that turns him into
Gilligan into Maryanne.
While he's in the bathtub talking to the skipper. He's talking to the skipper as himself, Gilligan. They're just casually talking. Then the skipper mentions Maryanne, and he flips out. He becomes Maryanne and thinks,
while he's in the bathtub.
And he's like, "How dare you, you brute! Why are you in the bathroom with me, a
Why are
naked
you in
woman?"
the girls' camp? You're right. It happens while he's in the bath, and he makes the joke. Gilligan as Maryanne is like, "Why are you here in this, in the girls' camp?" And then he looks around and he's like, "Oh, I went to the wrong bathroom," and then runs out in a towel and comes upon the professor and Mr. and Mrs. Howell. So then we get the whole round robin thing again of Mr. and Mrs. Howell trying to say to one another that Ginger is Maryanne and Maryanne is Ginger, except for now Gilligan's also Maryanne and Ginger doesn't want to be Maryanne anymore. So we've got two Gingers and we're fresh out of Maryanne's. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, there's a lot of funny details in this. I noticed when the professor is hypnotizing her, he goes, "Now keep your eyes on this shiny object," right? Like they just wrote in the script object because they didn't know what it was going to be. And they couldn't bother to update it when he actually had his watch or whatever it was he was using. I was relieved that we at least get a solution that is not another strike to the head.
Yes.
At least they're trying different things besides just clobbering him.
Sure.
Clobbering her. And yeah, ultimately they're like, "Look, what we're going to have to do, right? She's obsessed with this idea of being Ginger, of being this actress, this performer. We're going to have to let her do that and make a fool of herself. Let her totally freak out under the pressure of being on stage and realize that she isn't a good singer. And then she'll snap out of it."
Yes.
Right?
So
Thank you, doctor.
The whole point was to not cause her to have this traumatic event because that would, make her have some psychological trauma. Now we're going to force her in to psychological trauma, put her on stage, put her in a dress. Oh, that's another cute bit. Maryanne is considerably shorter than Ginger, and so she's staying in Ginger's tent or whatever, and she cuts all of her dresses.
Now, can I tell you, watching this episode made me understand the meaning of the phrase "cut down to size." She uses that phrase literally, not as a turn of phrase.
Yeah.
And I've always understood that as, this'll cut him down to size. I never realized, that originally meant when you cut clothing to size to fit somebody. She says cut down to fit. And I realized, cut down to fit and cut down to size are these synonymous phrases that became a turn of phrase.
Yeah, look at that. So she does just that. She cuts all of Ginger's clothes down to size, as it were. And then we get this recreation of the very first scene where Ginger was performing "I Wanna Be Loved by You" and doing all of that stuff with the feather boa and the lips and the breathy
Marilyn
voice.
Monroe, like you said.
And so now we get Maryanne's turn to do it.
It's not like she's singing horribly. It's more like she just doesn't quite have the same chutzpah that the real Ginger has. And so instead of going "loved by you," she's just going "loved by you." And it's it's not great, but I'm not sure that this is going to traumatize her to the point that it's going to reverse her brain injury.
Well, no. And I mean, it didn't work at first, right? So she was mostly singing on key, and then she would have a bad note, on the U, she would be on the wrong note or something. And what kept flustering her was the boa. She couldn't remember the choreography and didn't know what to do with the boa. And then she was like, "Oh, wait, let me start again." And so started again, but then forgot the lyrics and got really flustered and is like, "So sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me," And that was kind of that was it. She was like, I just don't know. And then she tripped.
She trips or just sort of collapses, but problem solved.
Right. Except for Gilligan is still Maryanne.
Another secondary personality change.
Exactly.
We get that same "here we go again" note to end on. I also just wanted to point out, This is our second makeshift record player, right? 'Cause
Oh,
we have
yeah,
a little
that's
birdie
right.
one in the Flintstones, and we have a little whatever the hell their
They
Rube
use
Goldberg
the
thing.
ship's wheel.
Okay.
They've taken the ship's wheel off of the boat, the minnow, and it is the turntable. And then Mr. Howell is cranking some band that's turning another band that's making the turntable go around. So he's got to crank it like you would, an old phonograph or something, because there was no electricity to run that. But the other thing that I thought was an honorable mention was Mr. Howell does a fantastic Ed Sullivan impression to introduce Maryanne as Ginger in this ending scene. He's like, "Oh, we've got a really good show for you tonight," because Ed Sullivan famously didn't say show, he said shoe. So we've got a really big shoe for you tonight. And so he does this whole thing, and he really does sound like Ed Sullivan. It's great. And they give him a little extended bit there to do.
Yeah, and I like the fakeness of this show. I like that we're back in front of a studio audience, and this is just a little pile of sand and a few fake trees, and it's got that sense of there's this aspect of vaudeville to it, like the old-timey sitcoms where we're putting on a little show, and of course we're not on a real island and there's no real water anywhere, and that's sort of part of the charm. The other just random observation I wanted to make, we haven't talked about the skipper, and watching him, I was like, is this guy and Archie Bunker the same person? Did Carol O'Connor just split at birth and become this other guy? They're the same freaking person.
I know I was thinking the same thing. I was like, man, he must have taken some of that energy of the skipper and put it into his character, because Archie Bunker is an amalgam of, Jackie Gleason and Fred Flintstone and the skipper. It's this weird sort of confluence of other characters we've seen.
They look very similar, but I was surprised at the extent to which the skipper was so sort of goofy and low status. I would have guessed that Gilligan was the goofball and he would be a little bit more of the straight man, an authority figure. And I feel like the skipper is always tripping over himself and floundering and, "Oh, hey, sorry, do-we-do." He's just as goofy as Gilligan.
He's blustering in that way, and he is he's not dopey in the way that Gilligan is dopey, but he is he just can't get his act together.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
He gets into trouble in these little minor
He's
ways.
"You gotta do this, Gilligan, you just gotta do it. You gotta do it because I said you gotta do it." And then he runs out. He definitely isn't the straight man character.
No, he's ineffectual and,
I think that's more saved for Mr. Howell and the professor. They get that kind of straight man. He's more of just what are we gonna, Gilligan, you gotta do something.
So I don't know. Like I said, this one was so far the goofiest of the bunch. I appreciate that it didn't involve further head trauma. Moving on to Charles in Charge.
Here we go. I know you've been waiting.
I'm physically giddy and nervous. I feel like I'm on a first date or something, talking about Charles in Charge for the first time on the podcast. This is, of course, season 4, episodes 14 and 15, Charles Splits. But just to sort of back up and give some general context here, like you said, I think nostalgia-wise, Charles in Charge is my favorite sitcom. It's, it's just what, for whatever twist of fate, I was watching, from ages 12 to 14, 15 maybe. I was just in love with Nicole Eggert. I think, her and Tiffany Amber Thiessen were the two sort of queens of the teenage heartthrobs at those times. But Nicole Eggert he just had a certain something. I think looking back on it, the way that the show has a spectrum of ages, like a lot of family sitcoms try to do, but I think this one just really got it right for me, having the parents be a total non-issue, having all of the plots be either about these teenage girls and their sort of dating mishaps or high school mishaps, or these two college guys and their foibles. All of that was just exactly what I wanted to consume at that time. And here's the part that's a little tricky. while he's not necessarily the most admirable person in real life, I think Scott Baio just has this charisma. And as this Charles character, I just really bought into this sense of like decency and coolness that he had, where he can give you sage advice and he will tell you what the right thing is to do. But he's also just a cool guy and girls like him and he's got a lot of friends. And just he was able to sell that in a way that I just completely bought into and to an extent completely buy into now. And so I've seen every episode of Charles in Charge at least 5 times. We've watched them all together, you and me, within the first few months of our relationship. So yeah, I like this TV show.
Yeah, he wooed me with Charles in Charge.
What
Unfortunately. So, yeah. So Charles, I think you're right. He definitely is able to strike that balance, as fictionalized as it is, of the like, I'm cool, but also I'm a good guy. And this Chaz character is really fun because it's kind of like if Chachi grew up and turned into like a full asshole instead of kind of, getting the rough edges sanded off, as it were, by Joni. And so, yeah, I think this is watching Charles in Charge with you is a joy because you're like a kid in a candy store. You get so excited. And so it's fun to watch a show with someone who's such a fan.
Yeah. And so this one, right, Charles becoming Chaz, again, when we're talking about, let's do a podcast about all the silly sitcom tropes, like this jumps out immediately. And now that we're getting to, the 4th of our 4 shows here, you can really kind of look back and say, these kind of stories sort of draw a line in the sand between your sitcoms that are trying to have some grounding in reality versus your sitcoms that are going to be a dopey little vaudeville act in the form of a family story or
Absolutely.
whatever.
And we got more and more of that type of like dopey silliness in Charles in Charge as the seasons went on, and particularly when our friend Scott Vincent Baio was directing.
Yes.
And this is a double episode SVB joint, as it were.
Yeah, he directed probably at least a third of the episodes after a certain point, after like season 3 or 4. The ultimate Charles in Charge episode, just in case we end up never discussing it, I want to say it now. There's one where they meet a guy who has an invention that can turn anything into a hot dog. And so you take any object and smush it into this machine, and he presses a button and it spits out, what in real life is just a hot dog that has been painted with the pattern of whatever you put in there, like your shirt or something. And I just think of that as the quintessential, like that kind of sitcom, an 80s shot on video, goofy, made for syndication sitcom. Like that is that in a nutshell, in its purest form.
Yeah. And I think you can also kind of track the inanity of Charles in Charge with the descent of the character of Buddy Lembeck, who at first is just sort of like a surfer dude, kind of like friend, and then he gets more and more dopey and dumb and ridiculous until the last couple seasons we just it's nothing but him mugging for the camera after being called dumb or saying something dumb.
Yes, he's very dumb, but I would also argue that he's an example of one of these overall sitcom megatropes that you even see in Friends, which is the selective stupidity. Sometimes I'm dumb in the sense that I've never heard of Geoffrey Chaucer, and sometimes I can't even open a door.
Exactly.
It's going to be like I'm too dumb to live if that's what is needed for this joke.
Right. And that is what happened with Joey's character as time went on. Like you would, in Friends, you would see, he's supposed to be somewhat of a himbo kind of at the beginning, but towards the end of Friends, you're like, oh my gosh, he's touched. Like he needs his friends to make sure he can get to and from the subway.
Yeah. But so this episode starts with, and I think this is maybe going to be our sitcom study drinking game phrase, gender roles, right? We get this whole premise is Charles has this girlfriend that he's been seeing for a long time. Charles and Charge love to pull this maneuver of starting a story with this girl that you've been dating for the last 6 months or whatever. Like he's always in this relationship that has been going on for a long time, even though we've never heard of this person and he was with another girl the last time.
Right.
But yeah, this whole premise is Charles has this girlfriend who is sanding off his rough edges, as they say, and the sort of present example of this is they want to go to a movie. What movie are they going to go to? Well, of course, Charles wants to see the Dirty Harry Film Festival, right? But no woman would ever want to see that. And when he's called out on it later, what movie did you end up seeing? Cinderella, right? Which no man could ever possibly want to see. I will just go on the record, sign me up any day for Cinderella over Dirty Harry. But yeah, this whole thing is like, this girl is a bummer, man. She's, you're domesticated, you're not, you're not dangerous, or I don't know. He's just kind of losing his edge because of this girl.
Right. And at first when we hear this, it's Buddy complaining about it. And so Charles in Charge, the premise of the show is Charles is a college student and his day job, like how he's putting himself through college, is that he's a nanny to these 3 kids, 2 teenage girls and like a tween boy. And he lives in their basement. And the mom also kind of stepped away from her role midway through the series because in real life, the actress got married and kind of didn't want to be an actress anymore, but they didn't let her go from the show. So she just had some random appearances here and there, but mostly was gone for the 4th and 5th seasons. And so they had Ellen Travolta, who plays Charles's mother and also played Chachi's mother in Happy Days. They have Ellen Travolta come in and become a more prominent character as the mother of the children sort of fades out. And so we have the like older people dynamic of the grandfather, Walter, Charles's mom, Ellen Travolta, and then Charles and Buddy as the young people, but not children. And then you've got the 3 younger kids.
Yeah. Ellen Travolta is John Travolta's sister. She is the hammiest of the bunch by far.
Oh, she's so great.
She got her foot in the door those first few episodes. Oh, let me on the show. I'll be his mom. It'll be nice. So you need someone. And then she cranks it up to 1,000% with her frantically pacing around the set. But because of the shot, you can only pace 3 steps, so figure that out. Yeah, she obviously was like, let me go as big as I can.
Yes. So Charles and Buddy are having this conversation, and Buddy is explaining to Charles all the ways that this girl, Jocelyn, is no good for him. And he's saying that like, oh, Charles, you're just like, you're not yourself.
She's turning you into a namby-pamby poop squeak.
Yes. So Charles is like, that's not true. She just is making me a better version of myself. She wants me to be a little more cultured. And I absolutely can be a little more cultured. We all could use that, right? So Jocelyn comes in and it seems like Buddy's just kind of being overboard, right? But then Adam comes home from school and he got beat up by a bully.
Yeah, he's always being bullied. That's always this younger boy. That's like 80% of the time. That's his story.
So he comes in, he got beat up at school, and Charles is going to talk to him like, okay, here's what you need to do the next time you come upon a bully. And he's faced with this conundrum because he wants to tell him, you got to crack him in the skull, which, by the way, based on your like initial take on Charles, wouldn't be something Charles would ever want to say to begin with.
No, this whole story is uncomfortable and lame. I think that one of the most insidiously sexist tropes is this thing of the girlfriend or the wife as the sort of authority figure or the person.
nag.
Yeah, exactly. The sort of, limiting factor. And so in this case, yeah, it's debatable. Look, this is the 80s, right? How do you stand up to a bully when, there's not an easy, readily available question to what exactly is the right advice to give Adam in this case. But the way it's presented is Charles would like to say, if somebody starts with you, I think this is, again, sort of going back to Scott Baio's kind of old school, sort of tough but nice attitude. It's like if somebody starts with you and they're messing with you, then yeah, it's okay, or even like it's what you should do to confront them and if necessary to strike back. And he feels like he can't say that. And every time he's about to say that, she gives him this look and he kind of backs down. And yeah, the whole thing, I just hate that trope of like a normal girl is like somebody that you have to like figure out how to trick or like circumvent or something. It's just a lame sort of stereotype.
Right, that you can't be yourself because no woman would like you that way, so you should fake it when you're with her.
Yeah, and you have to go to lame movies because, women don't like action movies.
Right. And so he tells Adam, the kid, you need to turn the other cheek. And he's like, well, what if he hits the other cheek? And he's like, then you extend your hand in friendship. And, Jocelyn smiles and nods like, yes, that's my good boy, Charles. And Buddy's like, oh, geez, making fun of him. And so then we cut to downstairs in the basement, Charles's, apartment for all intents and purposes. That's where he lives. And he's trying to pick out what shirt he's going to wear for his hot date that night. And Sarah and Jamie are downstairs talking to him. And they're like, you got to talk to Adam. He went to school again today and got beat up. And he did what you told him. He turned the other cheek and the guy gave him a shiner. He's got a big black eye. You need to go help Adam. And he's like, I don't know what to do. I can't tell him because Jocelyn doesn't want me to do that. And I don't know what to say to him. And I don't even know. And Jamie's like, well, I'm going to go get him because you got to talk to him because he's beside himself. He's got a black eye. And Sarah stays down there. And Charles is like, I can't deal with any of this. This is too much. And he's all like emotionally overwrought because he's torn between these two things. And he's like, I can't deal with any of this. I got to go change.
Yeah. Well, he's already hinting at this idea of a personality crisis. Yes. He's sort of in a rhetorical way going, look, my girlfriend wants me to be somebody. Buddy wants me to be somebody. You guys want me to be this person. I don't know who I am anymore. And he's sort of, it's one of those classic things of like, I just wish I could ...
Well, and the last thing he says before he goes into the laundry room, which is off camera, is I've got to change.
Yes.
And so he goes into the laundry room to change his shirt, which he only ever has 2 buttons done on his shirt throughout
part of the Scott Baio
season 2
look.
On.
Yeah.
So he goes into the laundry room to change. We hear a thud, and then he starts hopping back and forth in front of the doorway that we can see, going ow, 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 ow. And we're meant to understand that he has banged his head. He comes back out, and he's like, how you doing?
Yeah.
Don't you call me Charles. Nobody calls me Charles. I'm Chaz. Call me by my real name.
The first thing he says when he sees Sarah in his room is he goes, this is a man's bedroom. Ain't you got no class? And so we are introduced to Chaz, right? Chaz is much more Italian than Charles.
Very Italian, very like Jersey. He's got the like
use
guys. And anyway, so he's like, oh, what are these gross clothes?
Yeah, well, no, what he says, I put this one down. I can't go looking like some fruitcake Count of Monte Cristo. And then he slaps Sarah's ass.
And she's like, what the hell just happened?
So there's a lot of instances in this episode of sort of adult things, or what I would consider like pretty inappropriate stuff for a family show, getting kind of semi-surreptitiously slipped in there. There's a time later when he mentions something like, oh, she can give me a valve job. And I was like, whoa, Jesus. Like there's little things like that I'm like, okay, all right.
He was talking about the fact that the new girl he starts dating, Tiffany, lives with a bunch of motorcycle mechanics and knows how to fix a car.
Okay.
So it was a double entendre, but he was in the process of describing that she knew how to work on cars.
Right. That's what I mean. In that case, it's a little sneaky, but that's still that's a definite allusion.
Oh, yeah,
but
absolutely.
Let's talk about the whole Tiffany aspect of this. In addition to Adam getting bullied, Charles has sort of been getting bullied by Daniel Baldwin.
That's right. Daniel Baldwin guest appears in this episode as Lyle the lunkhead, and he is in jeans and a jean jacket. Before Charles is changed, right, when Charles is not Chaz, Charles and Jocelyn go on their date, and they go to his mom's restaurant, the Yesterday Cafe, which is set up to look like a 50s diner, 60s diner. And there's this guy who looks an awful lot like a Baldwin. And we were like, which Baldwin is that? That's not Steven. Is that Billy? Because he's kind of like, thick. But we were like, oh, well, at this time, Billy was still skinny. It's not Alec. Which one is it? It's Daniel Baldwin. Daniel Baldwin is a tough guy. And he's like, hey, you guys are sitting at my table. And that was like, he wasn't having it. And Charles was going to stand up to him, but Jocelyn gave him the look again, like, you can't do that. And so he got soda poured on his hand as he extended it in friendship. And they ended up not getting their booth, but the guys, what ended up happening, he was like, oh, I gotta get out of here anyway. Come on, Tiffany. And she's like, I'm sure, here we go. And they walked out. Ellen Travolta, she was like, is there a problem here, boys? And Charles was like, no, Mom. And he was like, oh, Mommy. And then they ended up leaving because he didn't want to embarrass him in front of his mother.
Yeah, Charles gets razzed for being a mama's boy. But then, so when he shows up again as Chaz after his transformation, he essentially breaks up with his girlfriend, the nice girl, and walks over to those two, to Lyle and Tiffany, and slams down Daniel Baldwin with like a Vulcan neck grip thing. Lyle is very easily subdued, right? If he's supposed to be like the neighborhood tough guy, all you have to do, Scott Baio is like a third of this guy's size. Yeah. Oh, he's like Barney Rubble to his Fred Flintstone. All you have to do is grab this guy at a certain point in his neck, and like it's almost physically awkward for them to portray this, Scott Baio holding him like this, but he's completely disabled. And Scott Baio is basically like, hey, Tiffany, you're my girlfriend now. And he takes her, and now they're together and they leave.
Yeah. And this was super early on in Daniel Baldwin's career, right? This is like his first television role was an episode this same year. This is 1989. He did an episode of Family Ties as a guest spot. And then he did Charles in Charge.
Yeah, I think on Charles in Charge, they get him on the way up.
Yeah, they definitely do. He within that next year then went on and was in like Born on the 4th of July and like moved on to movies or whatever. But
yeah, so basically Chaz has fully taken over Charles's life and everyone is immediately alarmed, right? We have scenes with all the various characters immediately being alienated. The thing that is so interesting about where this story goes is that Chaz is strangely monogamous, right?
Yeah.
His immediate agenda is, I need to marry Tiffany.
I got to lock this girl down because she's so amazing. No wife of mine's going to work, honey.
Yeah, we get that he doesn't want her to work, which, again, all these shows are sexist as hell. But I thought that was such an odd plot twist. Like, I get that they don't want, it's something for everybody to be worried about. Like, no, don't get married. But it was just so interesting. Doesn't Chaz want to sow his wild oats? Why is his whole itinerary, I need to immediately marry this girl that I met a few minutes ago?
I don't know. Maybe he felt like he's done that sowing his wild oats long enough. But he also, I think he explains in the Valve Job comment about why she's like the perfect woman. He kicks Jocelyn to the curb because she's too square. And he's like, hey, you're with me now, honey, to Tiffany. And they get together and everything's great. But she's apparently in beautician school. So she comes back to the Yesterday Cafe after she and Chaz Lamborghini, as he signs his marriage certificate, have gotten married. They go to the Justice of the Peace. He calls home.
They are married by a homeless tramp.
Yes.
Right? It's supposed to be like that they're getting married in a circumstance that's so, like, they're not just eloping. They're eloping in like the shabbiest little, courthouse or whatever it's supposed to be. And so the guy is dressed like he's drunk. His clothes are all ripped. He's got like soot all over him. Like, it's just
he keeps
very
taking
comical.
swigs of something, a bottle that's inside of a paper bag as he's doing it. He's got that like fake beard thing that, when you were like dressing up like a hobo or whatever, you would put a beard like that on. But we find out later on that he's a huckster. He is a con man, and he's been arrested for, among other things, impersonating a justice of the peace. So the family has been freaking out because, well, first of all, they were trying to figure out how they can get this marriage annulled, because they're hoping that real Charles is going to come back and he'll be horrified at everything that Chaz Lamborghini has done. Right. But we forgot to talk about how Chaz Lamborghini has a series of wife beaters that he wears underneath his leather jacket. And they're all different colors. He keeps changing them throughout the 2 different episodes. And every single one of them is ripped in the exact same place, right at the bottom of his sternum, like where you can see his diaphragm. So you can see his abs, even though Charles isn't wearing a button-up shirt in this episode that's unbuttoned all the way down to Kingdom Come. He's got a wife beater on that's cut all of the different colors. It was like they laid them on top of each other and cut them in the exact same place. It's so ridiculous.
Yeah, Chaz definitely has a signature look, which is this one hole exactly dead center in the middle of his tank top.
So we find out that they're trying to say that the marriage certificate is void because he signed Chaz Lamborghini. They find out that's not true. He can use whatever name he wants.
Let's just pause on that for 1 second, because they're saying Chaz Lamborghini isn't his real name. Of course, part of the fun of the lore of Charles in Charge is that he has no last name. It's one of those things like you can't tell what state Springfield is in on The Simpsons or something. They never give you a last name for Charles. And as the series goes on, you have more and more reason to believe that he is Chachi from Happy Days,
Except
because
there's no Joni.
Right. But everything about him seems to line up with that same character, Ellen Travolta being his mom and everything. But yeah,
he would have, if he was Chachi from Happy Days, doesn't the timeline not work out? Because Happy Days was supposed to be in the 50s and 60s.
You're right.
And then Joni Loves Chachi was supposed to be in the 70s, right?
You're right.
So then he would have been.
No, it only works in terms of his actual age. You have to kind of look past the fiction of the show and just kind of see actual Scott Baio, perhaps starting with Bugsy Malone, where the movie where as a little kid he plays a singing gangster from the Prohibition times.
It's amazing. If you have not seen, it's called Bugsy Malone.
Bugsy Malone, must see for any Scott Baio fan.
So Chaz Lamborghini, they try to void the marriage certificate because of that. Dead end. So then they say, okay, well, what are we going to do? And then they find out that the guy who married them was a con artist. So one of the things he was arrested for was impersonating a justice of the peace. So the marriage certificate is null and void. But before that happens, Tiffany goes back to the Yesterday Cafe and sits down with Ellen Travolta and is like, I got to get rid of your kid. You don't like me very much, do you? And she's like, I wouldn't say that. And Tiffany's like, no, it's okay, but I'm better than your son. He's like a low-life drifter, and he tells me that I can't work, and I'm the best manicurist on the East Coast, so I'm not giving up my career for him, so you got to help me get out of this marriage. And we get another Ellen Travolta making a meal out of no lines at all, just like, yeah, I can't wait till this ends,
Yeah. So we have another example of the reverse bump on the head strategy. We haven't mentioned Buddy's sort of long-term girlfriend throughout these later seasons is Nurse Bennett. This is another thing that perfectly encapsulates the tone of the show.
Nurse Bennett knows everything, and she talks just like this.
Yes, she's a very silly character, and it's perfect for him because, like you said,
She wears a nurse outfit that looks like it's from a sex shop.
and they call each other Nurse Bennett and Mr. Lembeck.
Mr. Lembeck came in when his appendix burst.
Like you said, Buddy is a parody of himself at this point, and so if you want to switch it up a little bit and give him, a long-term girlfriend for a while, you can't just have some girl and say, well, I guess she likes him.
But they do that at other times.
I guess so, but I like the way they created this whole crazy character and just, like this cartoon character or like something at a Saturday Night Live and are like, let's have her be his girlfriend. And so she plays into the plots kind of the same way you're saying the professor does in Gilligan's Island. She's able to kind of throw in this, well, what I learned from medical school, blah, 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 and give us some crazy plot contrivance.
Right. So she was like,
Oh, that will explain the lumps on his head.
and Buddy's like, wait, explain it in non-medical terms for us.
Yeah.
And so then Sarah recalls that he bumped his head, and then Nurse Bennett is like, oh, well, if that's the case, then the solution is to bump him on the head again. So we get a great scene where Jamie and Sarah and Buddy are in the kitchen talking about how they're going to set it up so one of them can hit Chaz on the head with this like rubber mallet, and none of them want to do it. And Buddy's like, it's simple. It's super simple. It's not going to really hurt him. It's not going to crack his skull because it's a rubber mallet. It's just going to give him a bump, which is what he needs. And he twice during this like precursor scene is gesturing with the rubber mallet and bangs it on the counter, and it recoils back up and hits him in the face. But so they've got Charles sitting there, and Buddy's telling this long rambling story that sounds like Groundhog Day, but is really like the story of Groundhog Day, but he's talking about moles instead of groundhogs. And the girls have a great scene behind Charles where they're trying, like Jamie goes to hit him, and I know Baby J was drooling because we're in the 4th season of Charles in Charge now, so we're fully on Nicole Eggert is a sex symbol in real life, and the costumes for her changed as that happened. And so we've got her in this like midriff top that looks like overalls but only kind of goes to her ribs, and then she's got these little like she's wearing a skirt that has like a V, so it like dips down and you can see her belly button, and she's standing behind Charles with her arms over her head like she's going to swing this mallet come down on his head, and she is standing there frozen because she doesn't want to do it, and she looks really hot.
Yeah, Jamie's outfits have like a concept after a certain point. Like she's like working with different designers from scene to scene. But yeah, there's definitely, again, that aspect of vaudeville to this, that aspect of this, we're putting on a show for the studio audience and we're all trading turns with this mallet and stuff. But what ends up happening is none of that is even necessary. Charles just bangs his head on the table.
Well, no, they set it up because none of them can hit him. And so Jamie goes, Buddy, why don't you come back here and I'll explain to Charles what you mean. And so then Buddy comes around and he's got the mallet behind him and he's going to hit him and he can't do it either. And so then Buddy comes back around to the side of Charles and he's like, look, it's ridiculous. You signed your marriage certificate, Chaz Lamborghini. That's not even your name. Who has a name like that? It's ridiculous or whatever. And Charles stands up and towers over Buddy and says, I happen to like my name. And Buddy goes, oh, well, I guess if that's the way you feel about it. And he throws the marriage license down on the ground. And so he bends down and Buddy moves the table over on top of him so that he'll hit his head when he stands back up. So yeah, it's contrived.
Sure. But he hits his head, like, we didn't see, it happened off camera, the strike to the head that started all this, but this does not look that traumatic.
I mean, have you ever done the thing where you are up underneath something, misjudge it, and whack the back of your head?
That's what I wrote down.
It hurts.
If this is enough to change your personality, then I should have a different persona every time I come down to this studio because I'm constantly whacking my head. But yeah, it works. You know, we don't have to do the 10 times back and forth like on the Addams Family. We get one bump to the head, self-inflicted as the result of the contrivance, like you said. And Charles is back to normal, breaks off everything. You know, his whole life is back to normal. But again, Buddy now becomes Lord Budley. And he's doing the Fred Flintstone thing, right? He's becoming a classy guy. Yeah, episode over. So look, again, what can we say? It's a silly trope. It's like those first few times they did it, just legitimized it. You know, you can see these writers' rooms going, well, but wait a minute, that's not how that happened. Well, they did it on the Flintstones, they did it on Gilligan's Island, so
they did it on all of these other shows. So, like we said, there's a wealth of Amnesia episodes out there. We specifically honed in on some of these that were personality changes, but there's a lot of them where the personality change isn't an alter ego. It's like they just become more helpful around the house in ways that they never were before. And so their family, instead of like with Chaz, where the family's trying to like get him to change back and they don't like it, or like in the Flintstones where Wilma kind of likes it at first, but pretty quickly is like, ugh, I don't really want this anymore. There's a bunch of episodes out there like Green Acres and Married with Children where the family loves these new changes and tries to like keep the person from assuming their old identity.
Yeah. I was thinking, you know, trying to think just off the dome when we were doing this. What is that example that I cherish from my childhood of a story where the character forgets who they are because they got injured and everyone's depending on them? And then I realized it wasn't a TV show. It's The Muppets Take Manhattan, right? That's the best example of this, when Kermit gets hit by a car and he joins an all frog advertising agency.
Oh, that's
and
right.
Comes up with an ad campaign for soap. And then, you know, at the last minute gets brought out of it by, he gets socked by Miss Piggy. But yeah, look, anytime they do this, it's fun to see the actor play a completely different character, right? And again, it sort of draws a line in the sand. If you're on a more serious-minded show, you still want a chance to do something different. So you say, okay, how can we have this character grow and change in a way that makes some sort of sense in real life? And if you're on these kind of shows, you say, let's have them get bopped on the head and become a completely different person.
I think this one pairs nicely with like the Doppelgangers episodes because we get to have our actors play something totally different. Particularly this Chaz character is, you know, he's having
Frederick.
He's having a fun time. They're making a meal of it for sure. As you know, the actors, as we said, there are a ton of these out there, and they are memorable episodes. They are funny, even though they're wacky and silly and don't really like fit in a sort of normal, you know, straight down the middle kind of TV show thing. They can be done in so many different ways. The series finale of Full House is a two-parter where Michelle loses her memory, and we get like clip shows, right? And it's a tearjerker because it's the end of the series. So it can be done in so many different ways. And we know that you guys have favorites. So we only picked 4, but send us your favorites. We've got a list going. We're going to come back to this trope multiple times, I guarantee you, because one of my favorite shows, The Dick Van Dyke Show, is on this list. And it falls into this trope exactly. Dick Van Dyke becomes Antonio Stradivarius and is a little bit of a ladies' man. We've got to watch that one at some point and find some others to pair with it. So let us know what your favorite Amnesia storylines are in sitcoms.
Yeah, right on. So much for becoming a new person when you get bopped on the head. What are we talking about next week?
Next week, we're having an election. Our characters are running for class president, so we are throwing it all the way back to 1975. Welcome Back, Kotter, Season 1, Episode 5, The Election. Then we're going to watch Webster, Season 6, Episode 5, also called The Election. If you're looking for it on streaming services, though, it's listed as Episode 11 in Season 6. Then we've got Parker Lewis Can't Lose, first appearance also on our podcast, Season 1, Episode 4. The episode is called Parker Lewis Must Lose. And if you're going to watch that one, it is mistitled. So you'll want to watch Episode 4, even though the title is wrong.
Yeah, on Crackle, on the streaming service Crackle.
And then Blossom, Season 3, Episode 10, The Making of President.
Yep, that will be next week. And until then, we are the Sitcom Study, and we approve this message. Thank you for listening to the Sitcom Study. Tell us what you think or share your own TV tropes and topic ideas by sending a self-addressed stamped email to sitcomstudypodcast@gmail.com or find us on Facebook or Instagram. And if you like the show, consider leaving a rating or review on your podcast app. It helps us boost those precious Nielsen ratings. The Sitcom Study is recorded in front of a live studio dog.